Chapter 20. The Patriarchate of Gamaliel 4 and Judah 3. During the period from 279 to 320 of the Common Era, the leadership of the Jewish intellectual world in the land of Israel was held by a group of scholars known as the Amoraim, the interpreters of earlier legal traditions. These teachers carried forward the discussions of the Mishnah, the foundational body of Jewish oral law, and expanded it through analysis and debate within the academies of Palestine. Among the leading figures of this generation were Ami and Asi, two prominent scholars who worked closely together in the administration of the academies. Alongside them stood the brothers Chia and Simon bar Abba, active in the intellectual center of Tiberias, a major city of Galilee that had become one of the final strongholds of Palestinian Jewish learning. Another significant figure was Abahu of Caesarea, a major coastal city that also served as a Roman administrative center. Abahu lived during the reign of Emperor Diocletian, a Roman ruler known for his extensive reforms and for temporarily stabilizing the Roman Empire during a period of internal crisis. During this same era, a decisive transformation occurred in the religious and political landscape of the Roman world. Christianity, which had previously existed as a persecuted minority movement, gradually, although Palestinian academies still existed and continued to produce scholars, their intellectual influence weakened in comparison to the rapidly growing Babylonian schools of Sora and Pumbeditha. Many of the most important teachers of the Palestinian tradition during this time, including Ami, Asi, Chia bar Abba, and Zira, were themselves originally from Babylonia, illustrating the shift of intellectual vitality toward the Eastern diaspora. Abahu, in contrast, was one of the few leading figures who was born in the land of Israel itself. However, despite his originality and influence as a public figure, he did not possess decisive authority in matters of legal interpretation within the halakhic system. The superiority of Babylonian scholarship became so widely recognized that Palestinian leaders, such as Ami and Asi, accepted the authority of the Babylonian academies and acknowledged the leadership of Rab's successors in Sora. The younger Babylonian scholars increasingly surpassed their Palestinian counterparts in analytical precision and legal reasoning. As a result, the academies of Sora and Pumbeditha effectively replaced Sepphoris and Tiberias as the primary centers of Jewish legal development. During the same period, the patriarchs of the land of Israel, Gamaliel IV and Judah III, held formal political and communal leadership positions. However, their direct knowledge of legal tradition was limited, and they were frequently dependent on the guidance of the Amoraim, the scholarly interpreters of the law. Under Judah III, even the ancient ritual of verifying the appearance of the new moon, which determined the religious calendar, gradually lost its original significance and became largely symbolic. Earlier practice required witnesses to testify that they had observed the new moon, but with the advancement of astronomical calculation, this process became increasingly artificial. Eventually, it was acknowledged that calendrical computation could replace physical testimony, leading to the gradual abolition of the traditional system. At the same time, Judah III focused much of his attention on the organization and supervision of Jewish communal institutions. He appointed three leading scholars, Ami, Asi, and Chia, to travel throughout the cities of Judea to inspect religious schools and communal structures. Their mission was to restore institutions that had fallen into neglect. In one city where they found no functioning educational system, they confronted the local authorities and declared that true guardianship of a community did not lie in armed protection or civic defense, but in the presence of teachers who preserved moral and religious instruction. This reflected a broader shift in emphasis from physical security to intellectual and spiritual continuity. During the same period, Judah III ruled under the broader authority of the Roman Emperor Diocletian and his co-ruler, whose reign marked a temporary stabilization of the Roman imperial system. Diocletian, unlike many of his predecessors, did not initially adopt hostile policies toward the Jewish population. His primary religious conflict was directed toward Christianity, which he viewed as a disruptive force within the traditional Roman religious order. As a result, imperial decrees during this time targeted Christian communities, including restrictions on worship and the destruction of churches, but did not formally include the Jewish population within their scope. The Samaritan community, however, was affected by certain aspects of these policies. Despite this relative tolerance, tensions still existed between the Roman administration and Jewish leadership. Opponents of the Jewish community attempted to influence the emperor by presenting accusations against the patriarch and other leaders, claiming that they had mocked the emperor's background and personal name. According to these accusations, Diocletian had been offended by references to his surname and origin. As a result, he summoned the patriarch and several leading members of the Jewish community to appear before him at Panias, a city located near the northern region of Galilee. The summons created a legal and religious dilemma because it was issued shortly before the Sabbath, leaving the leaders uncertain whether to travel on the sacred day or disobey an imperial command. When they arrived at Panias, they were subjected to humiliating treatment, including instructions to undergo ritual bathing over several days before being granted audience. This was intended as a public insult, reflecting accusations of impurity directed against them. Eventually, the patriarch and his companions were brought before Emperor Diocletian. In their defense, they affirmed their loyalty and denied the accusations made against them. Their explanation succeeded in persuading the emperor, who ultimately dismissed the case and released them without punishment. Under the rule of the Roman Emperor Diocletian, a sovereign known in Roman history for enforcing strict religious uniformity throughout the empire, both the Samaritan population and the Christian communities were compelled to participate in sacrifices to the Roman gods. This imperial requirement created a decisive rupture. The Samaritans, who had long lived in proximity to the Jewish population and shared certain religious traditions, were now permanently excluded from the Jewish community. The relationship between Jews and Samaritans had always been unstable, shaped by shifting political pressures and religious disputes. At certain moments in history, they appeared closely connected, almost like neighboring branches of the same ancestral tradition. Yet at other times, even minor disagreements widened into deep divisions. After the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem by the Roman general Titus during the First Jewish-Roman War in the year 70 of the Common Era, relations between Jews and Samaritans were relatively stable. The Samaritans were, in several respects, regarded as strict adherents to ancient traditions similar to Judaism. Later, during the revolt led by Simon Bar Kokhba against the Roman Empire between 132 and 135 of the Common Era, the two groups again found themselves drawn closer together in shared circumstances of hardship. This proximity became so significant that the decision of Rabbi Meir, a prominent Jewish legal authority of that period, to classify Samaritans as non-Jews was not widely accepted among the population. Daily trade, shared neighborhoods, and economic cooperation continued to bind the communities together in practical life. Even Rabbi Yohanan, a leading teacher of the generation, did not hesitate to consume meat prepared by Samaritan hands, indicating a level of continued trust. However, later generations of scholars adopted a stricter stance. Among them was Rabbi Abahu, a respected teacher in the city of Caesarea in Roman Judea. On one occasion, Rabbi Abahu ordered wine from the Samaritan region. An elderly observer warned him that religious observance in that region was no longer consistently maintained. Concerned by this report, Rabbi Abahu brought the matter before his colleagues, Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi, both leading authorities in the scholarly centers of the time. They conducted an inquiry and ultimately issued a final ruling declaring the Samaritans to be classified as non-Jews in all legal and religious respects. This decision is presented as one of the last authoritative acts associated with the ancient Jewish High Court, known as the Sanhedrin, the central body responsible for religious and legal rulings. Notably, in connection with this decree, no reference is made to the Patriarch, the Nasi, who is the formal political leader of the Jewish community under Roman rule. His absence from the record suggests a decline in the practical authority of the Patriarchate during this period. The separation between Jews and Samaritans weakened both communities in different ways. Christianity, which had developed from the same historical and religious environment but had expanded beyond both groups, proved more adaptable to the broader Roman world. After this final division, Christianity spread rapidly throughout the Roman Empire, while Jews and Samaritans found themselves increasingly isolated in comparison. A symbolic interpretation later expressed this historical shift through the imagery of Golgotha, the site associated with the crucifixion of Jesus in Christian tradition, metaphorically placed upon the elevated structure of the Roman capital, representing the dominance of Roman power. In this symbolic framework, both Zion, representing Jerusalem, and Mount Gerizim, the Samaritan sacred site, were seen as overshadowed by emerging imperial and religious forces. During the Patriarchate of Judah III, who led the Jewish community approximately between the years 280 and 300 of the Common Era, a new and revealing development occurred. Although the authority of the Patriarch had declined significantly, the Jewish population in the land of Israel continued to maintain strong emotional and organizational ties to the House of David, the traditional royal lineage from which the patriarchs claimed descent. For centuries, official decisions of the Sanhedrin, especially those concerning the timing of religious festivals, have been communicated to distant Jewish communities through specially appointed messengers. These envoys were known as emissaries from Zion, and they carried both legal rulings and explanations of religious law. Originally, these positions were filled by respected scholars or members of the religious leadership. However, as wars, revolts, and Roman taxation increasingly weakened the Jewish population in Judea and Galilee, financial conditions deteriorated severely. The patriarchal administration found it increasingly difficult to sustain itself through internal resources alone. As a result, the patriarchs began to rely on contributions from wealthy Jewish communities outside the land of Israel. What had once been voluntary donations, originally sent as a gesture of loyalty upon the installation of a new patriarch, gradually developed into a structured system of taxation imposed for the maintenance of the central authority. During this period, Rabbi Judah III sent an emissary named Rabbi Chia bar Abba with official authority to collect such contributions. He was introduced as a representative whose authority was comparable to that of the patriarch himself for the duration of his mission. Rabbi Chia bar Abba was known for his moral integrity, but lived in conditions of personal poverty. Accepting this position required him to leave the land of Israel, a significant sacrifice for someone devoted to its religious and scholarly life. While residing in Tiberias, he had been supported by a wealthy and charitable family known as the House of Silvani, who provided him with priestly ties due to his lineage as a descendant of the priestly class of Aaron. However, a dispute arose when Rabbi Chia bar Abba opposed a ruling that another scholar had declared permissible. The supporting family responded by reminding him of his financial dependence. In reaction to this humiliation, he resolved never again to accept material support from others and chose to leave the land of Israel entirely in order to avoid such dependency. Within this scholar, a new intellectual tendency became visible among the Babylonian teachers who had migrated to the land of Israel. Rabbi Chia bar Abba became so absorbed in the study of the oral legal tradition that he paid comparatively little attention to the written Hebrew scriptures, known as the Torah of Moses. On one occasion, when asked a question regarding the wording of the Ten Commandments, he was uncertain whether a specific term appeared in the text, illustrating this shift in focus. He was known for a serious and strict character, following legal interpretations that emphasized restraint and separation from surrounding cultural influences, including Greek education, which had at times been permitted by earlier authorities. At this stage, leadership in the major academies of Tiberias was increasingly held by scholars originally from Babylonia rather than native inhabitants of the land of Israel. Two prominent figures, Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi, serve as leading authorities and successors in the scholarly tradition of Rabbi Yohanan. They conducted their public teachings in architectural structures known as colonnades, remnants of earlier Herodian construction. These lecture spaces, once filled with large gatherings of students during earlier generations, now reflected a reduced influence of the religious institutions of the land of Israel. During this period, Babylonia became the primary destination for Jewish students seeking advanced religious education. Although Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi held respected positions, they used modest titles and acknowledged the authority of Babylonian centers of learning, indicating a gradual shift in the intellectual leadership of the Jewish world toward Babylonia. Abahu of Caesarea on the Sea, a leading Jewish teacher and community authority in the coastal city of Caesarea in the Roman province of Judea, stood out sharply from earlier generations of scholars, such as Chia and the sons of Abba, including figures like Simon bar Abba. Unlike the ascetic and strictly tradition-bound teachers, Abahu lived with notable wealth and public visibility. He owned Gothic slaves, meaning servants taken from the Gothic peoples of Northern Europe who were often brought into the Roman world through war or trade, and he furnished his house with ivory seats, a sign of high status in Roman society. His profession was the production of women's veils, an occupation connected to textile manufacturing and trade. Abahu was also exceptional in his command of the Greek language, a language of administration, philosophy, and urban culture across the Eastern Roman Empire. Very few Jewish scholars of his time possessed such fluency. He regularly associated with educated non-Jews, including members of the Roman and Hellenistic elite, and he ensured that his daughter received instruction in Greek. In his view, knowledge of Greek was not a threat to Jewish tradition, but an additional refinement appropriate for an educated woman. To support this position, he cited a teaching attributed to Johanan ben Nappaha, one of the leading sages of earlier generations, suggesting that such permission had traditional backing. However, this approach drew strong opposition from Simon bar Abba, a strict interpreter of religious discipline who rejected secular learning. He accused Abahu of misrepresenting the authority of Johanan, implying that Abahu justified his own practices by appealing to that revered teacher. In response, Abahu insisted that his statement was genuine and faithfully transmitted from Johanan's own teaching. The tension between them reflected a broader debate in Jewish society over the legitimacy of Greek education alongside Torah study. In the cultural memory of the time, Abahu's openness to surrounding civilization was controversial enough that a verse from the book of Ecclesiastes was applied to him, expressing the idea that one should engage in the study of religious law while not entirely neglecting external wisdom, since righteous individuals are capable of fulfilling multiple duties without abandoning their obligations. In the city of Caesarea itself, the Greek language was so widely used among the Jewish population that even the central declaration of Jewish faith, the Shema, affirming the unity of God, was sometimes recited in Greek translation. Abahu's standing was not limited to internal Jewish affairs. He was highly respected by the Roman proconsul, the provincial governor representing imperial authority, and likely also by the Roman Emperor Diocletian, the ruler who reorganized the Roman Empire at the end of the 3rd century of the Common Era. His reputation for learning, combined with his dignified presence and generous character, gave him influence within official circles. Through this position, he was able to intervene and prevent several harsh measures against the Jewish population. One case illustrates the complexity of his role. 3 Jewish judges, Ami, Asi, and Chia bar Abba, imposed a severe punishment on a woman named Thamar, who was believed to have committed a serious moral offense. The woman responded by reporting them to the Roman procurator, the official responsible for legal administration, accusing them of exceeding their authority by issuing judgments reserved for Roman jurisdiction. Fearing retaliation, the judges appealed to Abahu to use his influence to protect them. Abahu replied that his intervention had been ineffective, possibly because of political hostility or personal interest surrounding the case. His statement was written in a carefully constructed form, appearing indirect at first but carrying a clear meaning. He indicated that he had resolved matters concerning the 3 accusers, whom he referred to using Greek names translated into Hebrew forms, while acknowledging that he had been unable to assist Thamar due to resistance or obstruction. This correspondence became known for its refined style, blending classical Hebrew expression with wordplay and adapted Greek terminology, a literary method admired for its sophistication, but also criticized for occasionally becoming overly ornate. Abahu's intellectual strength also placed him at the center of religious debate with early Christianity, which during the reign of Diocletian and his co-ruler Galerius was expanding rapidly within the Roman Empire. Christianity was increasingly organized as a universal church structure and sought to assert dominance over competing religious traditions, including Judaism and Roman paganism. In response, Roman authorities often reacted with persecution. Within this context, Abahu engaged in theological argumentation against Christian interpretations of Scripture. He rejected claims derived from biblical verses that were used to support emerging Christian doctrines. One such doctrine was the ascension, the belief that Jesus had ascended bodily into heaven. Christian interpreters in Caesarea, including Jacob the Manian, a physician aligned with Christian theological positions and associated with sectarian groups considered heretical by mainstream Judaism, attempted to support this belief using the biblical account of Enoch, a figure described in Scripture as having been taken by God without explicit mention of death. Abahu responded by demonstrating through parallel scriptural analysis that such expressions were figurative and referred to death rather than physical ascension into heaven. His method relied on careful textual interpretation rather than symbolic reinterpretation. In later generations, such public and direct refutation of dominant religious doctrines could have led to severe punishment or even execution. Despite his intellectual prominence, Abahu maintained a character marked by humility. When discussions arose about formally ordaining him as a rabbi with official authority, he declined in favor of Abba of Acco, another scholar, in part so that Abba could gain financial relief through the honor attached to the position. On another occasion, Abahu and Chia bar Abba delivered lectures in a foreign town, where Chia taught through detailed legal analysis of halacha, meaning the system of Jewish law, while Abahu presented Agada, the narrative and ethical interpretations of Scripture designed to be more accessible to the general public. The audiences naturally gravitated toward Abahu's lectures because they were easier to understand. Chia bar Abba, noticing the imbalance in attendance, expressed frustration. Abahu responded by comparing Chia's teachings to precious gemstones, valuable but appreciated only by a few experts, while describing his own method as resembling ornamental material that appeals broadly to many listeners. Abahu, a leading figure among the Palestinian scholars of the Amoraic period, once sought to calm an offended colleague named Chia after a dispute that had arisen between them. In an effort to restore harmony, Abahu showed Chia every possible form of respect and honor throughout the day, hoping to erase the sense of insult. Yet Chia remained unable to forget what he perceived as a slight against his dignity. This episode, although seemingly personal, is presented in tradition as a sign of a deeper transformation within Jewish scholarly life in the land of Judea. The discipline of halacha, meaning the structured study of legal tradition and religious law, once known for its intellectual rigor and demanding precision, was increasingly losing its audience. In its place, the more narrative-driven and emotionally engaging form of interpretation, known as Agada, began to dominate public attention. Abahu himself acknowledged this shift. In one statement reflecting both humility and self-awareness, he remarked that despite his reputation for modesty, he still fell short when compared with Abba of Acco, another scholar. He noted that Abba of Acco did not even become angered when his interpreter, known as a maturgman, added personal interpretations to the teachings he was supposed to transmit faithfully. This reveals a change in the structure of scholarly teaching. The maturgman, originally intended merely as a translator and public voice of the lecturer, increasingly began to insert personal interpretations into the discourse. This weakened the authority of the original teacher and altered the seriousness of academic instruction. Complaints arose that these interpreters accepted their positions not out of scholarly devotion, but out of vanity, particularly to display their rhetorical skill or musical voice. This decline was summarized in a critical saying, It is better to hear the severity of the wise than the song of fools, indicating that meaningful instruction was being replaced by superficial performance. Abba's character is also illustrated through a narrative reflecting social conditions of the time. During a severe drought in Judea, a common and serious crisis in the region, it was customary to select the most righteous individual of the community to lead public prayers requesting rain. On one such occasion, the person recommended as most worthy was a man known for his immoral reputation, ironically referred to by popular wits as the man of 5 sins, or Pentecoca. When summoned before Abba, this man openly admitted to his occupation. He described himself as someone who worked in and around public entertainment spaces, performing various marginal roles, including cleaning theaters, assisting bathhouse attendants, entertaining bathers with jokes, and playing musical instruments. When questioned further by Abahu about whether he had ever performed any act of genuine goodness, the man recounted a specific incident. While working in a theater, he encountered a woman in distress who explained that her husband had been imprisoned. She said that the only way to secure his release was to surrender her personal honor, meaning to submit to exploitation. Upon hearing this, the man sold all his possessions, including his bed and covering, and gave the proceeds to the woman so she could free her husband without compromising her dignity. Upon hearing this account, Abahu recognized a profound moral contradiction within the man, combining a degraded public life with a singular act of deep ethical sacrifice. He therefore declared that this man alone was worthy to lead the community in prayer during their time of crisis. At the same time, the cultural environment of the theater reflected a broader decline in moral seriousness. Public performances were no longer seen as centers of refinement or education, but had become spaces of ridicule and crude entertainment. Jewish traditions were often mocked and used as material for satire. Abahu himself, aware of these developments beyond the Jewish community, expressed concern about the way sacred institutions were being distorted for entertainment. One such example involved a theatrical scene in which a camel was presented in mourning attire. The dialogue explained that the camel was mourning because Jewish observance of the sabbatical year limited agricultural production, reducing available food resources, and thereby affecting the camel sustenance. In another scene, a comedic figure appeared with a shaved head, and the explanation given was that oil had become expensive because Jewish Sabbath practices consumed household resources during the week, leaving little for daily needs, thereby increasing demand for oil. These performances, according to Abahu's critique, demonstrated how Greek theatrical traditions had been degraded into crude parody, losing the artistic and intellectual depth associated with earlier classical drama. Although Abahu was respected for his knowledge of religious interpretation, particularly in the field of Agada, he was not considered a primary authority in strict legal analysis. His influence, however, extended significantly into the political sphere, which led his colleagues to treat him with excessive respect and avoid correcting him even when errors occurred in his teachings. During his leadership, the city of Caesarea, previously associated with earlier scholars such as Ushiah the Elder, became an important center of academic activity. It was elevated to a status comparable with Tiberias, another major intellectual center in Judea. In Caesarea, prominent Amoraic scholars gathered, contributing to its reputation as a major seat of learning. The synagogue in Caesarea, historically associated with the initial Jewish rebellion against Roman authority during the reign of Emperor Nero, came to be known as the Synagogue of Revolution, reflecting its symbolic connection to earlier political upheaval. Abba's life was marked by personal stability and familial success. He had 2 sons, Abamai and Chanina. Chanina was sent to Tiberias to complete his education, but instead of focusing on scholarly study, he devoted himself primarily to burial duties, assisting in funerary practices. In response, Abahu wrote him a sharply worded letter stating that there were already enough burial grounds in Caesarea and that academic study must precede practical involvement in communal service. Tradition presents Abahu as one of the final major figures of Judea in the Talmudic period. Over a span of approximately 15 centuries, Judea had produced generations of intellectual leaders, including judges, military leaders, kings, prophets, poets, scribes, political defenders, and teachers of religious law. With the passing of Abihu, this long historical sequence of major creative figures is described as coming to an end. According to later tradition, even the statues of Caesarea were said to have symbolically mourned his death. In Babylonia, during the generations following the deaths of the great founders of its scholarly tradition, Rab and Samuel, the movement of Jewish legal study did not weaken. Instead, it expanded with increasing intensity and structure. The intellectual foundation they had established in the Babylonian academies became so deeply rooted over approximately 50 years of development that it appeared stronger in exile than in the original land of Judea. What had begun as teaching within scattered communities had now become a fully organized system of study and discipline that shaped the entire society. Over time, Babylonia began to assume many of the cultural and religious functions that had once been associated exclusively with the land of Israel. Even economic practices connected to religious life, such as the distribution of priestly contributions, were redirected toward supporting scholars and teachers, reflecting a shift in values in which intellectual leadership replaced hereditary priesthood as the central authority. In effect, Babylonia developed into a self-contained Jewish social system, structured around the Mishnah as its legal foundation and supported by two principal institutions: the leadership of the Prince of the Exile, who represented political authority, and the academies, which functioned as centers of legal and educational interpretation. This intellectual revival also influenced the ruling families of the Jewish community in Babylonia. Members of the aristocratic leadership, including Nehemiah and Uckban, descendants connected to Rab's lineage, as well as their father Nathan, were appointed as princes of the exile during this generation. Because of their engagement with legal study, they were honored with the title Rabbana, indicating recognition as authorities in religious knowledge as well as political leadership. This development demonstrated that scholarly learning had become inseparable from communal governance. Within this environment, Babylonia experienced a cultural renewal that strengthened its intellectual identity and ensured the continuity of Jewish tradition in exile. The leading successors of Rab and Samuel played a decisive role in sustaining and expanding this system. Among the most prominent was Hunna, who led the Academy of Sora and became the central legal authority of Babylonia. He was recognized not only within Babylonia itself, but also by the scholars of the land of Israel, who voluntarily accepted his authority. Another major figure was Judah ben Ezekiel, who established a new academy in Pumbeditha and introduced a distinct analytical method for interpreting legal tradition. Nachman ben Jacob relocated his school to Shechan Zib along the Tigris River after the destruction of Nehardea in the year 259 of the Common Era. Other important scholars included Chasta, Sheshet, and Rabbah bar Abbo, each of whom contributed different approaches to legal interpretation, creating a diverse and dynamic intellectual environment. Hunna, born around the year 212 in the town of Diokard and dying the year 297, succeeded Rab as the head of the academy in Sora. His leadership became one of the defining forces of this era. Although he was connected by family ties to the Prince of the Exile, he was not initially wealthy and lived a life that combined intellectual authority with physical labor. He cultivated his own small agricultural field and personally engaged in farming work. He did not consider manual labor beneath his dignity and often emphasized that practical effort was compatible with scholarly leadership. He was known to say that he could not judge legal disputes unless someone was willing to work his land in his place, illustrating the integration of daily labor and judicial responsibility. A significant moment in his life occurred when he was observed working in the field carrying his farming tools. He was seen in this condition by Chama ben Anilai, a man of extraordinary wealth and renowned generosity within Babylonian society. Chama was known for his systematic and continuous support of the poor. His household functioned as an organized center of charity, ensuring that food and assistance were always available. He personally managed the distribution of aid in a way that preserved dignity, and he took special care to assist those who were reluctant to ask for help. During times of famine, Chama arranged for supplies of grain to be discreetly placed in locations where individuals could access them without humiliation. He also assumed financial responsibility for extraordinary communal taxes when necessary, often bearing a disproportionate share of public burden. Despite his immense wealth, he maintained a humble attitude toward Huna and, out of respect for his position as head of the academy, once offered to carry Huna's tools. Huna, however, refused, emphasizing that social roles and personal dignity should remain distinct even in moments of respect. In later years, Huna himself acquired significant wealth and expanded his agricultural holdings. He employed laborers to cultivate his land and managed livestock across the southern regions of Babylonia. His wealth was directed toward public welfare in a highly organized manner. During periods of environmental danger, such as destructive desert winds that damaged buildings, he personally inspected structures in the city of Sora to identify unsafe conditions and ordered repairs. When property owners were unable to finance reconstruction, he covered the costs himself. His home functioned as an open institution of charity, where access was deliberately unrestricted during mealtimes, and announcements were made to ensure that anyone in need could enter freely. He also maintained financial support for students who traveled to study at his academy, providing for their needs during extended periods of instruction. The number of students attending his lectures reached approximately 800, and the teaching process was organized through a system in which multiple interpreters assisted in transmitting his lectures to ensure clarity across the entire audience. Despite the deep respect he commanded, Huna's colleagues maintained a strict standard of accountability regarding moral and personal conduct. Within the scholarly culture of Babylonia, even minor shortcomings were subject to critical evaluation, as the teachers of the law considered themselves responsible for preserving the highest ethical standards within their leadership community. During the period of the Babylonian teacher, known as Huna, public religious and judicial life in Babylonia, the large Jewish population settled along the Euphrates region under Persian and later Parthian influence, became organized into a structured system that would remain stable for nearly 8 centuries. This organization was deeply connected to the great academies where legal study and interpretation of tradition were conducted. Over time, without formal decree, but through continuous practice, a clear hierarchy developed within these academies. The central institution was known as the Matibta, a term meaning a formal session or assembly. This was not a casual gathering, but an organized academic cycle held during specific months of the year, where leading scholars convened for legal discussion and teaching. At the head of this system stood the Resh Matibta, meaning the director or chief of the academy. This figure held the highest intellectual authority and guided the entire academic agenda. Beneath him were the Reish Kala, meaning the professors or senior lecturers. Their role was to prepare and explain the subject matter that the director would later develop into formal lectures during the Kala months, a designated period of intensified study and debate. Alongside this scholarly structure existed a separate judicial system. Legal cases were not yet confined to formal court buildings, but were still traditionally judged at the gates of cities, a practice inherited from earlier ancient Near Eastern customs. The judges serving in this capacity were called Dayan di Baba, meaning judges of the gate. Although they handled practical legal matters, they were subordinate in theoretical authority to the academy head. Their appointments were made by the political leader of Babylonian Jewry, known as the Prince of the Exile, who oversaw administrative and communal affairs. For 40 years, Huna presided over the Matibta of Sora, one of the most important academies in Babylonia. Under his leadership, Babylonia achieved a new level of intellectual independence from the Jewish center in the land of Israel. Huna adopted and strengthened a principle that had been suggested by his teacher Rab, but which had not been fully realized before him. This principle declared that Babylonia could be regarded as equal in legal authority to the land of Israel in matters of religious law. In practical terms, this meant that Babylonian scholarship no longer depended on approval from Judea for legal decisions. A statement became established in his time expressing this independence. Being in Babylonia was considered equivalent to being in the Holy Land with respect to legal authority. This did not completely sever ties with Judea, but it reduced its central dominance to a symbolic role. Only in rare or especially important cases was consultation with Judean authorities still sought. During Hunah's long leadership, the Academy of Sora became the dominant intellectual force in Babylonia. When Hunah died suddenly in the year 297 of the Common Era, he was over 80 years of age. His death marked the end of an era in Babylonian Jewish leadership. He was widely honored for his wisdom and moral character, and his passing was marked with formal eulogies that expressed deep reverence, including the statement that he was worthy of divine inspiration. His body was transported to the land of Israel for burial, likely according to his final wishes. There, leading scholars such as Rabbi Asi and Rabbi Ami received the procession and arranged for his burial in a site associated with another respected Babylonian teacher. This act reflected a growing tradition of burial in the soil of the land of Israel, which was believed to possess spiritual significance and purifying power. Over time, a belief developed that those buried in the land of Israel would be among the first to experience resurrection in the future age. Those who died outside its borders were imagined, in popular teaching, as undergoing a symbolic journey toward it. As a result, burial in the land became increasingly desirable among Jewish communities. This shift also reflected a broader historical transformation. The population of the land of Israel was steadily declining due to wars, taxation, and migration, while burial sites increased. The region that had once been viewed as a living center of religious activity became increasingly associated with the resting place of the dead. Large areas of central Judea, once densely populated and politically significant, came under non-Jewish control to the extent that discussions arose about their exemption from certain religious obligations tied to Jewish settlement. In contrast to Hunah, his contemporary Judah ben Ezekiel emerged as another major Babylonian authority. Born in the year 220 of the Common Era and dying in 299, Judah ben Ezekiel represented a different intellectual temperament. Although originally a student of Rab, he was strongly influenced by the style of Samuel, another leading Babylonian scholar, and developed his own distinctive method of legal reasoning. Judah ben Ezekiel was known for a forceful and uncompromising personality. He valued intellectual precision, but often clashed with others due to his strict positions and strong opinions. He belonged to an ancient family lineage that was believed by tradition to trace back to early biblical figures, and he placed great importance on family heritage and social status. He was critical of what he considered artificial refinement and disapproved of those who left Babylonia to study in the academies of the land of Israel. He believed that Babylonian scholarship should be self-sufficient and not dependent on external centers of learning. Judah ben Ezekiel founded a major academy in the city of Pumbeditha, located in northern Babylonia. This city had become an important intellectual center after the decline of earlier cities, such as Nehartia. The Academy of Pumbeditha would later grow into one of the two dominant centers of Jewish learning in Babylonia, alongside Sora, and would remain influential for nearly 8 centuries. In contrast to Hunah's more balanced approach, Judah ben Ezekiel developed a highly analytical and dialectical method of study. He was known for intellectual sharpness and was even described by his teacher Samuel as exceptionally acute. His approach focused on detailed logical analysis of legal texts, emphasizing distinctions, comparisons, and theoretical reasoning. Unlike earlier scholars who often combined legal discussion with broader moral or narrative teachings, Judah ben Ezekiel concentrated almost exclusively on legal interpretation and judicial reasoning. In his system, abstract analysis and practical legal application were closely connected, forming a highly structured method of study that would shape Babylonian scholarship for generations. The remaining portions of the Mishnah, meaning the structured body of oral Jewish law collected from generations of scholars in the academies of Babylonia and the land of Judea were not given equal attention in the school of Judah ben Ezekiel, the leading Babylonian teacher of his time. Judah ben Ezekiel, a major authority in the Academy of Pumbeditha, appears to have avoided detailed study of sections dealing with Levitical purity laws, meaning complex regulations connected to ritual cleanliness used in ancient temple service, because those laws were no longer practically applied in daily life after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. Under his influence, the vast system of Jewish legal tradition was reduced and focused to matters that had direct relevance to everyday conduct. He emphasized practical law, limiting attention to abstract or obsolete legal categories. In addition, he introduced a strict method of transmission in which not only the legal teaching itself was recorded and preserved, but also the names of the sages who had originally transmitted each tradition. This created a more precise chain of authority in legal memory. However, even within his own family, disagreement arose. His brother, known in the sources as Rami, also identified with the name Ami in some traditions, openly challenged the accuracy of teachings transmitted in Judah's name. He rejected certain legal rulings attributed to Rab, meaning Abba, Erika, or to Samuel, two earlier foundational Babylonian authorities, and insisted that the traditions had been transmitted differently than Judah claimed. His opposition was direct and public, creating intellectual tension within the same scholarly family. Rami went further by leaving Babylonia and migrating to Judea, the land of Israel. Judah strongly criticized such movement, regarding it as a violation of religious and communal stability. In his view, the earlier return of exiles from Babylonia to Judea under Ezra and Zerubbabel, leaders from the Persian period who rebuilt Jewish life after the Babylonian exile, had already been spiritually questionable. He interpreted the words of the prophet Jeremiah as indicating that the Jewish people were meant to remain in Babylonia as part of divine judgment. And he only justified Ezra's leadership by arguing that Ezra had brought back families of uncertain lineage to prevent improper intermarriage. Judah's strict concern for genealogical purity, meaning the certainty of unbroken and acceptable descent within the Jewish people, became one of his defining characteristics. He delayed the marriage of his own son Isaac because he was not fully convinced of the purity of the prospective bride's family background. This extreme caution drew criticism from his colleague Ulla, who questioned how any person could claim absolute certainty about their own ancestry, suggesting that historical events, such as the siege of Jerusalem, had already caused widespread mixing of populations. Judah's insistence on pure lineage also caused public disputes. A prominent man from Nehardea, an important Babylonian Jewish city, once visited Pumbeditha and claimed descent from the Hasmonean royal dynasty, the priestly and royal family that had ruled Judea during the period before Roman domination. This visitor, connected to respected families in his city, became offended when Judah was given precedence in honor and status. In anger, he insulted Judah using a distorted title. When Judah heard of this insult, he placed the man under ban, meaning formal exclusion from the community. The conflict escalated further when the visitor allegedly insulted others by calling them slaves, prompting Judah to publicly declare him of servile descent, meaning of slave origin, an accusation that carried serious social consequences. The dispute reached Nachman, the son-in-law of the exilarch, the political head of the Jewish community in Babylonia, known as the Prince of the Captivity, who held authority under Persian rule. Nachman, who was known for his own strong personality, summoned Judah to appear before him to justify his actions. This was unusual, as Judah was older and more established in authority. Initially, Judah was surprised at being summoned by someone of lower scholarly rank, but he was advised by Hunah, another respected Babylonian sage, to comply in order to preserve communal order and respect for leadership structures. Despite such conflicts, Judah's authority remained widely recognized. Because of his intellectual strength, sharp reasoning, and moral reputation, he became the leading figure of the Academy of Sora after the death of Hunah. The Academy of Sora was one of the two major centers of Jewish learning in Babylonia, alongside Pumbeditha. Under Judah's leadership, and later under his successor, The academies functioned as a unified intellectual system across Babylonia. Even communities in the land of Judea acknowledged his authority. On one occasion, he placed a formal ban of excommunication on a prominent member of the academy after controversy arose concerning that individual's reputation. When that person later visited Judah during his final illness, Judah expressed pride in having upheld disciplinary standards without regard to status or influence. Because Judah died without formally lifting the ban, the matter had to be referred to the authority of the exarch according to established legal procedure. Judah held the position of head of the Academy of Sora for only 2 years before his death at an advanced age, marking the end of a significant period in Babylonian Jewish leadership. After his death, the Academy selected as his successor an elderly scholar named Chasta of Caphri, born in the year 217 of the Common Era and dying in the year 309. Chasta had been a student of Rab, also known as Abba Erika, and held such deep respect for his teacher that he memorized all of Rab's legal rulings. He actively sought any additional traditions or anecdotes about Rab, offering reward to anyone who could provide further knowledge of his teachings. Chasta became known as one of the most fortunate of all the Amoraim, meaning the generation of Babylonian interpreters of earlier oral law. Although he began his life in poverty, he later accumulated extraordinary wealth, and his household became famous for prosperity, including the celebration of many marriages and a reputation for family stability. Intellectually, Chasta combined a strong memory of traditional teachings with a preference for sharp analytical explanation. At times, this led to tension with Huna, his earlier teacher, and a lasting disagreement developed between them, reportedly continuing for 40 years. Because of this conflict, Chasta eventually left Sora and settled in nearby Caphri, although he felt isolated there. Even when the Academy of Sora later sought his legal opinion on difficult cases, Chasta reacted with irritation, expressing frustration that his authority was being used without proper respect. Despite this, he maintained intellectual influence. During Huna's lifetime, Chasta even founded a school in Sora at his own expense in the year 293, although he continued to defer formal authority to his teacher and did not issue binding legal rulings. Only after Judah's death did Chasta finally assume the position of head of the academy. He served in this role for 10 years, guiding the institution until his death in the year 309 at the age of 92. In the generation following the early Babylonian masters of the Talmudic tradition, a sharp intellectual tension emerged between two major scholarly figures of the Babylonian academies, Marsheshet and Rav Chizda. Both were students of Rab, also known as Abba Erika, and also of Rav Huna, who had shaped the intellectual foundations of the Babylonian Jewish academies. Yet despite sharing the same scholarly lineage, they represented contrasting approaches to the study and interpretation of the oral law, known as the Halacha. Whenever Marsheshet and Rav Chizda engaged in discussion, a striking dynamic unfolded. Rav Chizda, known for subtle analytical reasoning and interpretive precision, often found himself confronted with Marsheshet's overwhelming reservoir of textual material. At the same time, Marsheshet, despite his vast memory, would react with apprehension to Rav Chizda's intricate argumentative methods. Each represented a different intellectual power, one grounded in textual totality, the other in refined interpretation. Marsheshet was also deeply critical of a particular style of study that had developed in the Babylonian Academy of Pumbedita, one of the two major centers of Jewish learning in Babylonia, alongside Sura. This method, associated with increasingly intricate and abstract legal reasoning, had evolved under the influence of earlier scholastic developments, but, in his view, had become excessive and detached from clarity. He frequently expressed his criticism through irony, remarking that in Pumbedita they could pass an elephant through the eye of a needle, a metaphor describing arguments so excessively subtle that they appeared to reverse natural logic. His attitude toward the political authority of the time, the exarch, known in Aramaic as the Resh Galuda or head of the exile, further reveals the social tensions of the period. The Resh Galuta represented the political leadership of the Jewish community in Babylonia under foreign imperial rule, combining administrative authority with symbolic descent from the Davidic royal line. Despite being invited to dine at the residence of the Resh Galuta, Marsheshet repeatedly refused. When questioned about his refusal, he explained that he could not accept hospitality in a household where the servants or slaves were reported to practice the unacceptable custom of cutting meat from living animals for the preparation of meals. Whether or not the exilarch himself was aware of such behavior was secondary in Marsheshet's view. The moral responsibility of the household reflected upon its leadership. His refusal, therefore, became a silent but forceful critique of the decline in religious discipline within elite circles. Reports also circulated that servants in the household of the exilarch sometimes treated visiting scholars with disrespect, even subjecting them to humiliation by confining them in underground spaces. Such accounts contributed to a broader impression that political authority had become detached from the ethical standards expected by the religious scholars of the academies. Marsheshet's life eventually took a new direction after the destruction of Nehardea, one of the earliest and most important Babylonian Jewish centers of learning. Following this disruption, he established a new academy at a location called Silhai along the Tigris River, continuing the transmission of legal tradition in a reorganized scholarly environment. Within the same intellectual generation, another major figure emerged, Nachman ben Jacob, born approximately in the year 235 and living until the year 324. He was a disciple of Samuel of Nehardea, one of the leading Babylonian authorities. Nachman represented a different social and political reality within Babylonian Jewry, one shaped by prosperity, administrative influence, and strong connections with the ruling structures of the Exilarchate. He was married to Yalta, the daughter of the Exilarch, making him part of the ruling household of the Jewish diaspora leadership. Through this marriage, Nachman acquired both prestige and political authority, and he was appointed chief judge by his father-in-law. His position reflected both legal authority and aristocratic status within the Babylonian Jewish community. Nachman's judicial behavior often reflected confidence bordering on arrogance. He considered himself uniquely qualified to judge legal matters and did not always defer to the collective authority of his fellow scholars, even though traditional procedure emphasized collegial deliberation. In disputes, he sometimes acted independently, a practice regarded as a departure from established scholarly norms. Accounts preserved from this period also describe tensions involving social justice and elite privilege. On one occasion, servants associated with the Exilarch forcibly seized building materials from an elderly woman in order to construct a temporary religious structure. When she brought her complaint before Nachman, she protested that even the highest authorities were effectively benefiting from what she regarded as stolen property. Nachman responded in a limited, legalistic manner, awarding compensation only for the materials themselves, without broader condemnation of the act. His response illustrates the tension between strict legal interpretation and moral expectation in society. His household behavior further reflected the hierarchical and aristocratic norms of elite Babylonian society. Female slaves within his household were not granted permanent marital stability, but were reassigned according to perceived utility or economic benefit. This practice stood in contrast to the more stable arrangements advocated by earlier scholars, such as Samuel, who had encouraged structured marital bonds even among servants. Nachman's wife Yalta also played a significant role in shaping the social atmosphere of their household. Known for her sharp wit and aristocratic pride, she expected deference from visiting scholars. On one occasion, when a scholar named Ola failed to show sufficient respect, she insulted him, reflecting the social tensions between intellectual authority and aristocratic privilege within the Exilarch's household. Within the field of Jewish jurisprudence, Nachman introduced an important legal innovation known as the oath of denial in cases of complete denial of debt claims. Earlier legal tradition required an oath only when part of a claim was acknowledged, based on the assumption that individuals would not completely deny a legitimate obligation. However, social reality had changed, and Nachman observed that individuals could exploit legal technicalities to avoid responsibility. Therefore, he instituted a binding oath even when a claim was entirely denied, thereby strengthening judicial enforcement. This ruling became widely accepted and integrated into later legal tradition. Nachman later relocated from Nehardea after its destruction and settled in Shak Zib, a location noted for its inhabitants' reputation for satire and mockery. Whether he later returned to Nehardea after its restoration remains uncertain, but his influence continued to shape Babylonian legal thought within the evolving structure of the academies. A connecting figure between the land of Judea, meaning the ancient Jewish homeland in the region later known as Palestine under Roman rule, and Babylonia, the major center of Jewish life along the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, was a scholar named Zira, who later became one of the leading authorities in Judea in the following generation. His life reflects a clear tension between the two great centers of Jewish learning, where Babylonia had developed a highly analytical method of study, while Judea preserved a more straightforward and traditional style rooted in the schools of Galilee. Zira had been trained as a disciple under the great Babylonian teachers Huna, the head of the academy, and Sora, and Judah ben Ezekiel, the founder of the school in Pumbeditha. These academies were central institutions of Jewish legal and religious study, where the oral law, later recorded in the Talmud, was developed and analyzed in detail. Despite his training in Babylonia, Zira grew dissatisfied with the highly intricate and logical style of interpretation used there, which often involved deep comparison and analytical breakdown of legal texts. He longed instead for the simpler and more direct teaching style practiced in the schools of Galilee and Judea. However, he hesitated to leave Babylonia, since his teacher Judah disapproved of emigration, considering it a break from the established scholarly community. Eventually, Zira left secretly, driven by a strong desire to reach the land of Judea. According to tradition, his urgency was so great that when he reached the Jordan River, he crossed it using a rope rather than taking time to search for a bridge, reflecting his determination to enter the land as quickly as possible. During this journey, a Christian observer, witnessing his haste, remarked critically that the Jewish people had not yet abandoned their historical tendency toward impulsive action, referencing earlier biblical narratives associated with Mount Sinai. Zira responded by expressing that he could not delay even for a moment to enter the land of Judea, which held such deep religious significance that even Moses and Aaron, the foundational leaders of Israel in biblical tradition, were not permitted to enter it. Once Zira arrived in Tiberias, a major center of Jewish learning in Galilee, he attempted to distance himself from the Babylonian style of study, which emphasized complex analytical reasoning and detailed legal argumentation. According to tradition, he engaged in extended fasting, lasting 40 days, as part of his effort to spiritually detach from the Babylonian method and to internalize the intellectual approach of Judea. He prayed that the influence of Babylonian interpretive methods would fade from his memory. In contrast, he viewed the intellectual atmosphere of Judea as elevated and refined, considering it to be closer to the original spirit of the tradition. He described the intellectual environment of the Holy Land as being filled with wisdom and clarity. However, despite his efforts, the Babylonian method of analytical reasoning had become deeply embedded in his thinking, and he was unable to fully abandon it. This internal conflict made Zira a unique figure in Judean scholarship. While he attempted to adopt the simpler method of teaching in Judea, his mind still operated with the analytical structure of Babylonian learning. This combination, though unintended by him, ultimately contributed to his recognition among the scholars of Judea, who regarded his intellectual depth with respect, even if he himself valued simplicity more highly. Because of his abilities, he was soon granted the formal status of teacher, an official recognition within the academies of Judea that allowed a scholar to issue legal rulings and teach students. Zira, however, remained extremely modest, in a manner compared to the biblical King Saul, who initially avoided public leadership. Zira hesitated to accept this position and only agreed when it was explained to him that ordination carried with it a form of spiritual merit and forgiveness of sins. During his formal recognition, traditional words of praise were spoken about him, noting his physical appearance as unremarkable in external display, but marked by an inner appeal and dignity. He was described as lacking outward brilliance or show, yet possessing a quiet and enduring presence that distinguished him among scholars. Zira became one of the prominent authorities in Judea, alongside leading figures such as Ami, Isi, and Abihu, who represented the scholarly leadership of that period. Over time, Zira outlived many of his contemporaries, maintaining his influence within the academic and legal discussions of Judean Jewish life. After his death, a poetic lament was composed in his honor, reflecting the way scholars of that era were remembered not only for their legal teachings, but also for their intellectual contributions across the two major centers of Jewish learning.